But this morning we're going to continue the sermon series on good news, and so this began after Easter when we all just recognized that, hey, there is good news that we have in Jesus Christ and in God and in that truth, and specifically on Easter Sunday, talking about the good news of the resurrection, that Jesus rose from the grave, conquering sin and death for all of mankind. What a blessing that is. And then we just decided to continue that out because the reality is that there's good news all throughout the Bible. And so we've talked about the good news of parenting. We've talked about the good news of forgiveness. And then I get the blessing and the privilege to talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is patience. Don't you love talking about patience? It's something that I think we all struggle with a little bit. I know that for me, growing up, I always thought that I was a fairly patient person, that I could tolerate a fair amount before kind of losing my cool. And then I had kids. The reality is I started to learn so much about myself and learn so much about what it means whenever you really have your patience tested. But it's a hard subject, right, for all of us. I still think that, relatively speaking, in most circumstances, I'm a fairly patient person. And who would this morning just say, you know what, most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, I'm fairly patient. Would you agree with that? Anybody? Yeah. I know that there's more of you out here. So I was looking at some studies. There's some independent studies that actually look at this in people, and about 80% of the population would say, "Hey, I'm fairly patient. Most of the time, I'm a patient person." 97% of people taking this study showed that, or would say that patience is a virtue, so something that you should strive for as a person. But it's interesting because I thought the same. I was like, oh yeah, I'm a part of that 80%. I'm a part of those patient people. And then I started reading some of the other responses that they were finding. And they found out that 96% of those people would knowingly drink or consume hot food that they know could burn their mouth, and probably would, and they would still eat or drink that anyway. And so if any of you have sipped that hot coffee way long before you should have really consumed that, you can relate to that. I know that I did. Also, 71% of people speed to get to their destination faster. That one hurt a little bit. I don't even know if, honestly, I may have had some of that happen on the way to get here this morning. And so, but the reality is I think a lot of us can be guilty of our impatience when driving. 72% of people push that elevator button after it's already lit up. Can anybody relate to that? You know, you push it a second or third time thinking that it's going to make that faster for you. 50% of people hang up within the first 60 seconds after being put on hold. Which seems like a very short amount of time, but yeah, most people won't wait longer than that 1 minute. 50% of people also admit to honking right after the light turns green. The light turns green and immediately you're on your horn trying to get through that light there. And then most people would say the average is that you should only have to wait 11 minutes for your phone to reach full charge. Yeah, I was surprised by that number, and I think a lot of us could relate to this. The whole thought of binge watching TV, I think, is a phenomenon of our generation, just being more and more about this immediate need culture. They even release seasons now where they release the entire season at a time as opposed to in segments. But I don't know if any of you can relate. I know that there's several times that during my lifespan, particularly a season where my wife and I were watching the series Lost, when it would be 3 a.m. in the morning and you have to be at work at 8 in a few hours, and you reach the end of that episode and there's this giant cliffhanger and you're just like, I've got to know what happens next. And so you watch the next episode. That's the only option that you have at that moment. You've got to know what happens next because you can't wait 24 hours to not know what happened to that person who seemed like they just died or whatnot. But I think we can all relate to that. So the reality is as we look at that study, as we look at just our culture in general, our culture has a problem, right? I have a problem, and that problem is patience. And I feel like as time goes on, our culture becomes more and more impatient. As we see things like Amazon, it's now a normative thing for us to get a delivery in the mail 1 day later. If it's not there the next day, we're going to buy a more expensive version of that so we can get it there the next day. So there's just all of these things, and but the reality is even though no one wants to talk about patience, the bad news about patience is that there's good news about patience. And so we've got to talk about it. That the Bible has good news about this idea of patience. So this morning we're going to be in John 11. So if you want to flip there, and I'm just going to pray over us one more time before we kind of start reading. We're going to be in John 11, verse 1. Lord God, I thank you for this opportunity this morning to dive into this subject of patience. Lord, even just recognizing that I'm not perfect by any stretch in this category, but God, that you have something for each and every one of us here in this room. That you're going to teach us and grow us in some way that we would just be a little bit more of an image bearer of you as we grow in our patience and look to your patience. God, we love you, and I just pray that you would be with us during this time. Teach us, I pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to look at John 11, verse 1. To set the scene here a little bit, this is the story of Lazarus that some of you may know. But this is a time in Jesus' ministry. He's in the middle of his ministry. He's been healing people. He's been preaching the gospel. And he's done so much so that the Jews in the area have kicked him out of that area. They've threatened to stone him. And so he's taken his disciples to another area to kind of escape the persecution that they're already feeling because of the good things that Jesus is doing. But we're gonna start here, John 11, verse 1. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with anointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So these sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, so when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this, he said to the disciples, let us go to Judea again. And then we're going to skip down to verse 11. After saying these things, he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told him plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. And so as I look at that, I see some very interesting things, some interesting dynamics between the relationships of these people. And one of those is kind of at this beginning whenever Mary is pleading with God. But the reality is that we know that God is patient with us. He's patient with Mary, he's patient with the disciples, and he's ultimately patient with us as well. If we look to verse 3, Mary, particularly whenever she's sending this message to Jesus, she says, it's him who you love, Jesus. Remember that this is someone that you love. And I hear just this pleading sense in her heart that she's trying to just nudge Jesus a little bit there. Like, don't you remember, this is Lazarus. It's not just some person. I know that you're busy preaching the gospel. I know that you're busy healing other people. But remember that Lazarus is this one that you loved, Jesus. We need you here, Jesus. And it just struck me there a little bit that she's in this place where she's urging with him, and then Jesus still doesn't respond with this immediacy, right? That it's not something that he immediately leaves with. And then we see a little bit later, even as he's talking with the disciples, him being patient with the disciples as they're just not really understanding the gravity of the situation. As he says, hey, our brother has been asleep. We need to go to him. And them not understanding and saying, oh, he's going to wake up. It's no big deal, Jesus. But Jesus reminds them, no, this is a big deal. We're going to do it this way. And so God is patient with us. And so as we look at that and we're writing things down in your notes, I want you to write down that God is patient with us, that through Scripture we can know the truth, the good news that God is patient with us. Because God is patient with us in those circumstances whenever we're trying to learn things and we're just not getting it. He's also patient with us in our sin to forgive us time after time. And I don't know if you can relate to this, but I know whenever I'm thinking through just all of the things that I want in my life to change, I look at, maybe it's my diet, my exercise regimen, look at my finances, things like that. I start making all of these goals, and I want to get to from 0 to 100 overnight, right? I want to go to sleep and wake up the next morning, and I want to be there. I want to have arrived. Okay. The reality is we can't do that. And God doesn't do this either. He doesn't work in seconds. He works over a lifetime. I remember a time in my childhood whenever I was just afternoon at home alone, and I was gonna try to make something. I think my mom was napping or something like that, and so I was gonna make something to eat, and we had some cookie dough in the refrigerator. And so I was like, man, I want a cookie. That sounds great. So I'm just gonna have a couple. I don't need a big fanfare. We don't need to use the oven, right? Like, you don't have to use an oven to bake a cookie. And so I decided I think it'll be all right if I just put it in the microwave. And so I put these little nuggets of these cookie dough on this sheet, and then I put it in the microwave. And I'm like, okay, you don't need the full 15 to 20 minutes that you would typically need for cookie dough because it's a microwave, right? You can do that faster. So I put it in for 10 minutes because that sounded like a good idea to me. So I put it in, and just like any kid, I'm going to walk away and wait until it beeps. So I'm in there watching my show, and then I start smelling this odor, and I'm like, man, this doesn't smell like the way cookies typically smell whenever you make them. And then I walk back into the kitchen to see black smoke billowing out of the microwave because the cookies aren't made to be made in under 15 seconds with all of this radiation permeating through this dough. And so just a terrible situation. But the reality is I understood then that I couldn't just make what took minutes to make. I couldn't make that in seconds. That it was going to be a longer process, that there's an important reason why you have to go through that. God's like that with us. I think sometimes we get to that microwave mentality and we want to see change in our life. We want to see change in things so quickly. But God doesn't work like that. He changes us from one degree to another. It says in 2 Corinthians 3:18 that we are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. And I can truly say that's a true statement, that as I look over my lifespan, if I think of 20 years ago, whenever I became a Christian, I'm a different person today, that God has been transforming me into his image. But that it's been a process, right? And it's not something that's happened overnight. So I want us to remember that God is patient with us, that even whenever we're impatient with ourselves and whenever we're impatient with where we are at in our own lives and in our own spiritual relationship with the Lord, that God is patient to look past that and to change us slowly. There's a famous person, you may know him, Bill Gates. He has this famous quote. He says, we often way overestimate what we can do in a short period and drastically underestimate what we can do over a long period. And I think of how oftentimes that's true. We try to get things done in the immediate and forget that we can do so much if we focus on long-term goals. And so that's the first point here, that God is patient with us. That's the good news of patience. God's patient with us. The next point I'd like to draw from the text is that God's timing is perfect. I don't know if any of you thought it was odd that it specifically said that Jesus waited an extra 2 days after he heard that Lazarus was ill. You know, this person that he did love, and he genuinely did. He was dear to this family there. But he waited an extra 2 days. And I think we can all kind of scratch our heads at that and be like, why would Jesus do something like that when he knows that he has the power to heal, the power to save? But I think we get our answer in verse 15. It says, and for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him. So the result is still the same, but Jesus says, it's for your sake that I waited. It's for your sake so that you can believe. You see, Jesus wasn't on our timing. He did what he did when he did it for a reason. It was for a purpose. And if we think about the what came from this truth here, the fact that he rose Lazarus from the dead. So much happened because of that. One, Lazarus was raised from the dead. What a glorious thing. That's good. But Jesus fulfilled prophecy in the Old Testament that would declare that there would be a Savior that would come and be raising those that were asleep. So he fulfilled prophecy to prove that he was the Christ. He also did this in front of others to show and prove that he had power over death to those that were around them, not only Lazarus' family, but also the city of that time. And we're going to find a little bit later that even stretched into those that were even wanting to stone him before. And then even millennium after this, we're still talking about this, looking back at this circumstance, remembering God's faithfulness, remembering Jesus' power, and recognizing him as the Savior. So because Jesus waited for Lazarus to die, and to be dead for several days, actually. They even said that they didn't even want to open the tomb because they thought that Lazarus' body was going to be rotting, that the stench would be so overwhelming. So he let Lazarus die for such a long time that then he could be brought to glory so that we would believe in him. And in Romans 8:28, it says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." And that's the reality that I think we all need to get to, is we all need to get to where we can trust in God. Trust in God that his timing is perfect, because he is working together all things for our good. Kind of a takeaway statement that I'd like you to think about is that God's timing is not only perfect, but is for purpose, for our good, and for his glory. Whenever God is in his timing, and he's doing things in that way in our life, he gets glory, and we get benefit as well. That's where we want to live, church. That's where I want to live. I want to live in a place where I can truly say that I'm waiting on God. And so as we're looking at these first 2 points, that God is patient with us and that God's timing is perfect, those are both things that we're looking at, the good news of the way that God is towards us. But now I want to transition a little bit to where let's start talking about how this affects us, right? Because there's an effect that happens whenever we start to recognize these truths. As we recognize that God is patient with us, that God's timing is perfect, that affects us by allowing us to trust in that perfect timing. That our patience displays trust in God. As I was thinking through this sermon here, I was thinking about what causes us to be impatient. And I think there's a lot of things, but one of the biggest things is a lack of trust. So whenever you're impatient with that coworker, you may not trust that they're going to do what they said that they were going to do. Whenever you're impatient with the person in front of you at the stoplight, it's because you don't trust that they're going to wake up and see that the light's green. And so I think our impatience shows a distrust in whatever we're being impatient with. And that's why if we become patient people and we have patience towards God, that's whenever we can truly show and display to others that we have trust in him and that he's worthy of our trust. We put our trust in a lot of things. I think you guys could think through a lot of simple things that we put trust in. One of those is just like even Google Maps. Just you look up online to find out how long it's going to take for you to get to a certain destination, and you change your schedule in order to be able to be there at a certain time. We also trust Yelp reviews as we're trying to think about a place to eat. You look it up online and you find out, okay, this place is not where I want to be going. I want to go to this place instead because it has better reviews. If you have allergies, you may be able to relate with looking at an ingredient label and trusting that those people who made those ingredients lists are being truthful and that food only has those ingredients and nothing else that could be potentially harmful to you. And so there's a lot of things that we trust in. We just have to make sure that we're also trusting in God in those same ways, because God is ever more worthy of our trust. So as we continue to look through John 11, the story transitions where Jesus and the disciples are approaching the home of Lazarus and Mary, and they see Mary run out to Jesus, and she is in tears. It says she's mourning, she's weeping, she's in pain. You may be able to relate with that if you've lost a loved one, just the pain and turmoil that she's going through. But she says this in verse 32. It says, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. That's a real statement. That's real life, right? I know that I've been there in my own personal life where I begin to question God and just be like, God, if you would have done it this way, if you would have done it the way that I'm seeing it right now, the way that I would have wanted it to do, the way I would have done it, then this outcome wouldn't have happened. If you would have just been this way, this could have played out so different. So I relate with Mary here as she's in pain, questioning God, but it's easy to be in this place. But it's right to be in the place where we trust him in his timing and knowing that he's patient with us and that he's loving us in all those circumstances. Growing up, Katie and I, she's my wife, we've been married, we got married young. We were always this couple who was looking forward to the next stage of life. We constantly looking forward to, dating, and it's like, oh, we want to get married, and now we're in school. We can't wait to graduate, to start a career, and even as we're doing that, just thinking, man, we really can't wait to have kids, and so let's go ahead and get into that. Even so much so to where we got pregnant 9 months before I graduated from college so that we could actually pay for this family of ours. We were just so eager and so impatient to get to these next stages of our life that we were almost pressing ourselves forward into these areas, not fully appreciating where God had us in these moments. And I know that for just a lot of my life, that can be kind of just the mentality that we had toward things. But there was a time in our life we had, this was a few years ago when we had been fostering to adopt for about 4 years, and we just had adopted our fourth child, Olivia, out of foster care. Blessed day, wonderful time, but we were struggling internally with this idea of, okay, our foster care license is about to expire. What are we supposed to do at this time? Are we still supposed to press in? I feel like God's telling us to not really do that right now, that we need to wait, that there's something else that he has going for us. And so just through some prayer and through some conversations with each other, just really felt like God was asking us to wait. That there was something that God had on the horizon for our family that we didn't know yet, but that we needed to be ready for. And so we let our foster care license lapse. I can even remember feeling like, oh, today's the day where we can no longer be foster parents. Like, that just kind of happened. And that feeling weird. But 3 months later, right after we let that foster care license lapse, we came out on a mission trip. We're able to meet a man named Ryan Ivey here in Las Vegas. We're able to hear about the way that God had given him a vision for Mountain's Edge in this area, and Image Church. And we very, very immediately knew that God was calling us to join this faith family. And we, if we would have been impatient, could have been in the middle of a foster care situation where we would have been controlled by the government, the foster care agencies, because you can't just uproot a family and move to another state. That doesn't happen. But because we were patient in that circumstance, we allowed for God to be able to use us in a way and move our family to Las Vegas to be able to be a part of this church. And so I think that's what it looks like just in both times whenever my family and myself were not being patient with where we were, and then whenever we truly were being patient and trusting God, how he can use that faithfulness to impact so many. And so you may be thinking there's so many things that you're trying to be patient for, whether it's you've got a family member who's ill and you're praying for a healing in that situation, whether it's a loved one or a coworker who is far from Jesus and you're praying for them to know Jesus and to grow into a relationship with Jesus. You're waiting patiently for that. whether it's for a job or even for your children or future children, that you're praying that God would grow your family. I would just ask for you to trust God because he's worth your trust and worth your faithfulness. The other thing is, too, is in our waiting, we can think of that as kind of a void as we're waiting for that next thing, as we're in a place where we know that God is bringing us to something, but we're not there yet. That in our waiting, that God is teaching you. So my next point is that God is teaching us in the waiting. So oftentimes we can get discouraged, church. We can get discouraged whenever we don't see those answers right away, whenever we don't see those promises come to fruition. But God is growing you. And I think even as we look to the life of Mary and the life of the disciples, that he was teaching them something as they were having to be patient and waiting on him. They were teaching him something about God's faithfulness, about trusting in God's truth. So we need to be a people that are responding to God's patience with us, his truth to us, and that then we respond in faithfulness and patience, waiting on God's timing, waiting on his perfect timing, knowing that it has a purpose. And then the production of that, the produce of that, is his glory. Again, and as we look at the end of this story, Jesus finally does. He comes to the tomb, rolls the stone away, and Lazarus walks out. That he calls out to Lazarus, his friend, and he walks. He's alive. The people celebrate. They're excited. What a joyful moment. And in this excitement, verse 45, it says, "Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him." And I'll remind you, these are the Jews that he had just left the chapter before because they were threatening to stone him, because they hated him for the things that he was doing, for the proclamations that he was making. And now they're believing in him because his timing was perfect, because he waited and then he acted in a way that would bring himself glory. So I want you to know, church, again, that as you are patient, you're showing your trust and your faithfulness in God, and that can lead others to understanding God's faithfulness and understanding God's truth. And so as we kind of close here, we all have a next step. Just as Taylor was mentioning earlier, we have a next step in our relationship with God. That next step for you may be understanding that Jesus does have power over sin and over death, that he conquered the grave, not only for Lazarus, but for you as well, that whenever you die on this earth, that you don't have to stay dead, but that you can rise to live eternally with God forever. And by putting faith in Jesus Christ, you can have that gift. That may be your next step. Your next step may be thinking about those situations in your life where you've been losing patience with God because he seems to not be answering that prayer that you've been looking for him to answer for some time. And just reflecting on his goodness and remembering that God's timing is perfect and renewing your patience with him, saying, God, your timing's perfect in this situation. Even though I would have done it differently, your timing's perfect. So I trust you in this. And if you're not in a season where you feel like you're patiently waiting on God to answer prayer, maybe your response is just recognizing, man, God is such a good God to me, to be patient with me in my daily life, to forgive me of my sins, and to help me grow as a person, to get from that 0 to 100, that image of God that he's creating one degree after another. That you would just remember and reflect on God's goodness, and you would say, God, I can't wait to see what you're going to do in my life in the next year, the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, as I just wait for your timing in my life to grow me in to the man or woman that God has for you to be. And so I'm just going to ask you to bow your heads. We're gonna pray here, but I don't want you to listen to me pray during this time, because I'm just talking to God. But you in your own heart, pray to God. We're going to have the worship team come up, and they're going to lead us in a final song. But take these moments to pray over what God's next step would be in your life. What God would ask for you to do in this season, whether you're in waiting, being patient with Him because of a struggle that you have, or whether you can just celebrate God's goodness in that.